The perfect storm is brewing. Extreme weather conditions, climate sensitive sectors, and limited fiscal space make us vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Without the necessary finance and commitment from larger countries to reduce greenhouse emissions and the development of our productive sectors in a more environmentally sustainable way, life as we know it can be reduced to rubble. We need to prepare for future storms. This requires innovative thinking, increased adaptation, mitigation, finance, and a proactive approach to building resilience. Climate change is happening now. Warmer waters and intensified hurricane seasons, soaring temperatures, and loss of vital sectors are already impacting us. Rueanna Haynes, Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean, Professor Michael Taylor, Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and Cletus Springer, Chairman of the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute. We'll chat about some of the climate change challenges facing the Caribbean and how we can mitigate the climate crisis. I'm David Ellis on behalf of our hosts, the Central Bank of Barbados, welcoming all on television and online to the Caribbean Economic Forum. Building resilience against climate change is our focus tonight, and we look at how small island states, as the most vulnerable in the world, can better prepare for the climate crisis.
And a warm welcome to you across the Caribbean tonight. I guess you already know that the Caribbean is really on what is considered to be the front line of this fight against climate change. Against that background, therefore, we put a question to some people across the region, and it was to look at how concerned they are about climate change. The vast majority of them said that they are concerned, 86%. Tonight we go first to Professor Taylor of the University of the West Indies. And we ask you, Professor Taylor, to outline to us what is the role that the University of the West Indies is playing in this matter. And before you do that, though, just define for us what are we talking about when we mention the terms climate change and global warming. Good evening.
Hi, good evening. It is, let me just start by saying it is a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. And what a timely discussion this is. You would have recalled that the IPCC only on Monday released its new report, and it is, if you have not seen it, it's a stark report, which does not speak well about how we are doing as a world with respect to climate change. When we're talking about climate change, what we are really talking about are long-term changes in measures of climate. Measures of climate like rainfall, which we are used to, measures of climate like temperature, which we are used to, wind strength. So long-term changes. So we often distinguish this from things like weather. Weather is what happens tomorrow or the next day. Climate is those longer term changes over seasons, over a number of years, over decades, and even longer. It's very important to point out, however, that when we're talking about climate change, we are also, in a real sense, talking about climate that has changed due to human activity. There are a couple of things that can cause the climate to change. One is natural variations, and we know that our climate changes naturally, especially over hundreds of thousands of years. So being a good history buff, you talk about the Little Ice Age, that kind of thing. That's natural variations of climate. The climate can change on, a short term due to something like a volcanic eruption. When we are talking climate change, and tonight, the discussion we're really having is the long-term changes in these measures of climate due to human activity, and specifically due to two kinds of activities, due to the burning of fossil fuels, the coal, the gas, the things we use to run our transportation, to get our electricity, and of course also the changing land cover. All right, so the one other thing I would add then is both of these kinds of human activities put, produce greenhouse gases. And you often hear about climate change in the context of carbon dioxide. They cause a lot of emission of greenhouse gases, and the result is that the earth warms. And so, one of the major manifestations of climate change is this increasing warming of the earth we have seen due to human activities over the last century. And that warming we refer to as global warming. That warming then leads to other climatic changes, which we can talk about.
How much of that are we seeing in the Caribbean, or have we seen so far? And what is the role of the University of the West Indies in all of this?
So the University of the West Indies has a number of arms that investigates climate change. In fact, the University of the West Indies has just launched recently a global institute on climate smart and resilient development. And what it has done is brought together the arms of the university looking on climate change. So, for example, the arm that I represent is the Climate Studies Group MONA. We try to deduce the science of climate change at the small island scale. One of the problems we have had for many years is that, yes, a lot of people were putting out the science of how climate is changing, but they certainly weren't doing it for the small islands or certainly for regions like ours. So the group that I am as a part of the university has taken on the mandate to produce the science so as Caribbean people, we can talk Caribbean science. Other arms of the university look on other things, the impact of climate change, the policies we need for climate change. And I'm sure you'll get into some of that as you go throughout the evening. Let's talk a little bit, though, as you asked, about what is it we are seeing in the Caribbean. So from the perspective of the kind of work that I am doing. The truth is, as in your introduction, the climate is already changing and is already changing in stark and drastic ways. And this is true even in the Caribbean. If your viewers should take home one word for the present climate change, take home unfamiliar. What is happening is we are entering into a new climate era marked by unfamiliarity. What on earth do I mean? Well, what are the changes we have seen? One, we too have gotten hotter in the Caribbean region. And that manifests itself in many more hotter days in a year now than we had 50 years ago, and many more hotter nights in the year than we had 50 years ago. And when we reach very hot at the peak of our summer season, we are hot. So we have seen that manifestation of climate change. We have seen much more variable rainfall, and your viewers will relate to this right across the Caribbean. This rainfall season is almost now unpredictable. One year we get a whole lot of rain, and then another year we get none. So variable rainfall. We've seen higher sea levels, and we can locate this in our various islands and territories with things like receding beach lines and loss of coastline. We have seen more extreme and intense hurricanes. Think 2017, 3 Category 5s. Think 2019, Dorian. Think 2020 when we exhausted the names in the alphabet. And then, of course, we have other things in the ocean, things like ocean acidification, ocean warming. And so when you put all of these together, we're not seeing one or the other. What we're seeing is compounded hazards. And this introduces a whole element of unfamiliarity. We're entering into a climate era that is marked by unfamiliarity, where we always have one or two or even three or more of these things happening at any given time. And that is spelling problems for us already in the issue. Now we can talk about what is going to happen, which is a lot of the science that we do, but bear in mind unfamiliarity as what we have already seen.
Well, thank you very much. Let's go next to Rueanna Haynes. Rueanna can tell us about the organizations that she's associated with, but we also want to get a sense of how she sees the region responding to the challenge. Good evening, Rueanna.
Hi, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. So I work with two organizations. The first is Climate Analytics, which is a not-for-profit think tank headquartered in Berlin that works at the interface of climate science and policy, and that has worked alongside countries of the Caribbean for many years in the context of the discussions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Climate Analytics has recently established a Caribbean office, Climate Analytics Caribbean, based in Trinidad and Tobago, and I'm the head of that office. And that office is going to be focusing more specifically on assisting countries of the region with implementing the Paris Agreement and deepening the existing relationships that the parent organization has already established. We'll also be looking at the issue of climate justice alongside other institutions in the region. I also work with Independent Diplomat, which is a not for profit advisory group based in New York, in the US. And their work focuses on helping very small countries advance issues of great international importance at the global level in a diplomatic sense. And so they have been working with the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which is an atoll nation, Pacific Island state, that has been the convener of the High Ambition Coalition since 2015, which is a group of both developed and developing countries that work side by side to push for high ambition outcomes from the United Nations discussions on climate change. In terms of my outlook for the region and how I see the regional response on climate change, I would say that there's been a lot of work that has been done at the regional level. And this is both in the context of academia, as we just heard from Professor Taylor, in terms of the work that is being done at the University of the West Indies, also at the government level. Caribbean governments have been at the forefront of enacting climate policy. They've been at the forefront of pushing for more ambitious climate action in the context of the global discussion. What we do need to see more of at this point, though, is actual implementation of those policies. We are at a point where we need to accelerate our response to the global climate crisis. We are now at a
In what
crisis
specific
stage.
areas?
We are at
In
a
what specific
crisis
areas?
stage we are at a crisis stage in the sense that the impacts that we are already experiencing that Professor Taylor spoke to are accelerating, and they are accelerating dangerously so. And I would say we need to accelerate our action in every area. So we need to accelerate our action in mitigation. So we need to accelerate our action in reducing actual greenhouse gas emissions that lead to global warming. We need to accelerate our action in adaptation to help our island states, our countries, be able to adapt to the impacts that we are already experiencing. So to the increasing sea level rise, the increasing variability with rainfall that is causing unprecedented and unfamiliar flooding in areas where we have never seen it before, that is causing, hurricanes like Dorian, and more active hurricane seasons in general. So we need to accelerate our action in adaptation, and we also need to accelerate our action in dealing with loss and damage, because as these climate impacts increase, the losses and the damages that result will also continue to increase.
Thank you. Our third panelist is Cletus Springer. And Cletus, give us your overview of how you see the region responding against the backdrop of the organizations that you have been associated with, and you have been associated with many of them, and in particular, the one that you're working with now.
Thanks a lot, David, and good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. A very interesting question, David. I think if I'm to grade the region's action on climate, I would put it at a B plus, in a very conservative kind of assessment. As you heard earlier, while we've done quite a few national reports, we have prepared policies and things of that sort, the implementation deficit is quite stark. And to some extent, the lack of implementation or the slow implementation may be a function of the availability of financing. So far, we have tended to look more to external sources for this financing, and the speed at which this financing has been made available, with the average project taking between 3 to 5 years to move from conceptualization to implementation, that time frame does not speak to an urgency in terms of response. And so I would like to see the region utilize a little more creatively the funding that is available for budgetary resources. I still believe that there are too many projects that have been implemented in the region that do not reflect a deep enough consideration of climate change impacts. I still see hotels going up and being approved for the coastal zone. I still don't see enough attention being paid to building the resilience of our water resources. In many cases, the water resources that we use are surface water resources, except for the Bahamas and Barbados. We saw in Dominica recently with the storms that and hurricanes that affected Dominica, in a country with a very, very high mountainous country. We saw some very extensive damage being done to the water sector there. And I have to say, Dominica, perhaps of all of the countries in the Caribbean, is the one that has a culture, has developed a culture of resilience to climate change and is moving steadfastly to build its resilience to climate change, all the way from relocating vulnerable infrastructure to building the resilience of the health sector, which is not always often seen as part of the climate change agenda. So I give Dominica top marks for that. But overall, I think we need to do a better job of, we need to accelerate our adaptation initiatives.
Thank you. At this stage, let's go to another survey question. And this one is asking the opinion of those who have been surveyed to find out what, in their view, makes the Caribbean most vulnerable to climate change. The answers are 23% said our size and location, 27% said lack of action from larger nations that are more responsible for climate change, 30% said limited funding and resources to prepare for climate change, and 30% said limited funding, and 20% said lack of local and regional policies and initiatives to combat climate change. Rueanna Haynes, your thoughts on the responses to that question?
I like that it was a pretty even spread across the responses to the questions, because I would say it's all of the above. There should have been an all of the above option. It's well understood that the Caribbean region is particularly vulnerable to climate change for many reasons. Reasons relating to geography, small size, reasons relating to vulnerability to external shocks, extreme weather events, small economic bases, limited fiscal space, increasingly the issue of sovereign debt is also one of the issues that we need to add there. There's a plethora of reasons that make this region particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But I also appreciate that included in the list there was the question of this lack of implementation of actual national policies, which seems to be a bit in focus here tonight, that we're speaking about, because that's also one of the reasons I think that definitely contributes to the vulnerabilities that already exist. I think I would definitely agree with Cletus's observation that, there is a lot more that could be done at the national level in many of our countries to adopt this sort of culture of resilience that he described in Dominica, and to help us to not make ourselves even more vulnerable than we already are. And a lot of it does not seem to be happening at the scale and at the pace that it needs to happen.
So the logical question is, what is holding us back? Professor Taylor, would you want to give your thoughts on the factors that are inhibiting us in this regard?
Well, before I do that, I wanted to add from the science perspective, because I'm a scientist, parts of, even before we even get into the fact that we don't have policies, there is an inherent vulnerability in the Caribbean region from a science perspective, because climate change is picking up what I'm calling an intense or in strong sensitivity to climate that is built into our everyday life. So you heard Ron allude to some of this. One, just where we are located. We are located within this tropical belt where we're in what I call extreme weather alley. Hurricanes, tropical storms. We're prone to cold fronts in the far North Caribbean. So we can't escape this. Our size, and we are small islands, we live on coastline. So everything you can think about that is major cities, lighting, electricity infrastructure, health centers all exist within a few kilometers of the coast. And if you try to get away from the coastline, you're into, in most territories, a steep, hilly interior, rugged interior. That adds another sensitivity to climate. The economic activities that we make our livelihoods out of, tourism and agriculture, strong sensitivity to climate. Cletus alluded to the quality of life sectors, water, when you think about health as well. So we have this strong sensitivity, which I think many times we don't pay attention to. We pattern our lives around climate. We plant around what we expect the pattern to be. And what climate is doing in this unfamiliar era is taking that sensitivity and turning it into an extreme vulnerability. Now, it means then that part of what's holding us back clearly is our lack of wholesale recognition of this sensitivity to climate and how much it pervades every single area of our life. We're talking of very often we reduce climate to something, a weather phenomenon or an agricultural phenomenon, but it is our water, it is our energy bill, it is the insurance rate that you pay, it is the health and the outbreaks of dengue. And so when we fail to recognize this inherent sensitivity, and we fail then to recognize what climate is doing to it, the second part of that is also when we fail to come to terms with what climate is doing from a science perspective. So we feel that climate change is something that we can put off. Your poll said that. Many of them said, I have other matters to worry about. Or we don't recognize what is coming, which is the unprecedented to match the unfamiliar. Because what is coming is going to be an era we have never lived through before. So even greater change in those areas than what. So a failure to recognize the sensitivity and acknowledge it, failure to recognize what is coming, a lack then of seeing climate in all our sector plans, not just in specific sectors. And then I'm sure the other colleagues will add other things. I heard Cletus alluding to it, the lack of putting climate financing in our budgets. Our Caribbean territories are about the time when everybody will be putting forward a new budget. How much of the budget in each sector really reflects an understanding of this sensitivity, this vulnerability that climate is taking the sensitivity and turning it into the future plans of climate? I think those are some of the reasons within the science context that we need to begin to contend with.
Okay, so let's go to Cletus Springer, and he's one of the panelists here, reminding you who our panelists are. Cletus Springer, Chairman Designate of the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, Professor Michael Taylor, Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the Mona campus, and Rueanna Haynes, Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean Office, and she is also responsible for working with independent diplomats. Now, coming out of your work with independent diplomats, Rueanna Haynes, you work with the Marshall Islands. We talk about being on the front line, but from what we gather, they are even more so. What are the lessons you believe we can learn from the experiences that they are having with climate change?
Yeah, so the Marshall Islands is actually an atoll nation, which is one that is developed based on coral. So it's a coral island, and it's very low lying. The highest point is no more than a few meters above sea level rise. And, being in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, that makes them exceedingly vulnerable to climate impacts such as increased sea level rise, king tides, and hurricanes. Um, Although they call them, I think, cyclones in that part of the world. And so their experience has been one that is similar to what we have here in the Caribbean, but I would say in some ways even more extreme because of an enhanced level of exposure to the impacts of this crisis. And the approach that they are taking is one where climate permeates sort of every single um, level of their society, every discussion, every policy that is being discussed, it always comes back to the impacts of climate change. Every development plan, it's an issue that is included. What I've found in my work with them is that there's generally a much higher, I would say, recognition of and understanding of the fact that we are in a climate crisis, that climate change is a very serious and urgent problem amongst Marshallese people than generally, I would say, amongst Caribbean people, especially amongst the youth. The youth in the Marshall Islands are very, very active, very, very knowledgeable, and very aware of this issue. And, they have also taken to the international stage to advocate for stronger action in defense of their islands and in defense of their future. And so I think in terms of lessons that we can learn here from their approaches, it comes back once again to making sure that there is that climate-centered approach to how we implement our development objectives, how we set our development objectives. I think in the Caribbean, we have been a bit slower in this task of really integrating climate concerns into our overall development plans, in particular our long-term and shorter-term development plans, tending to keep them separate, tending to silo climate issues as environmental issues. But from what we understand and from what we've just heard Professor Taylor so eloquently explain, we don't have time for that type of approach anymore, and we do need to take a different approach, which I think we see more clearly happening amongst our colleagues in the Pacific than we do here.
Any comment from you, Cletus Springer, on what we've heard so far?
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with Rueanna more. I too have worked in the Marshall Islands, and I have to say that the whole of society approach to climate change that they've adopted there is exactly what we need to see in the Caribbean.
Is that because they're more threatened? Is that because they're more threatened than we are?
Well, I that's probably one little area where I may disagree with her, in the sense that we have more at stake in terms of the social and economic impacts of climate change, because we have larger economies than the Marshall Islands, for example. We have bigger populations, for example, as well. We have a tourism-dependent economies in the Caribbean. So I would say from that perspective...
You're going to have to stick a pin there. You're going to have to stick a pin there because on our return, we're going to hear from some of those who have been monitoring us on social media.
Okay.
Thank you.
Join PBC Jamaica for A Different Life, a window into the world of persons with disabilities. Sundays at 10 a.m. with a repeat on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. That's A Different Life, right here on PBC Jamaica, the People's Station.
COVID has stressed me. Do take the vaccine.
And through it all, our healthcare workers have been the real MVPs tackling COVID-19. Caring for you is our priority. As frontliners in the pandemic, they got vaccinated.
I got the vax. I had to protect myself so that I can protect you. No, sir? Me, stop fret because my vax up.
I made sure my mom and I got the vaccine. Protection is key.
Me, vax up, me stop fret.
Fam, help us protect you,
your family and friends.
So should you.
Enough now. Take the vaccine.
Get vaccinated. Get back to life.
Here is a special parenting message brought to you by the National Family Planning Board, 5 Sylvan Avenue, Kingston 5. There's no job more important than parenting. That was a special parenting message brought to you by the National Family Planning Board, 5 Sylvan Avenue, Kingston 5.
Over 100 murders in 1 month, Jamaica? We can't continue like this. The killing must end. Do right by the future generation. Get the guns, save our country.
A major area in high school for me was IT and EDPM. I did that for 2 years, and from then I realized that there was a drive for more of technology. So I decided to take this step.
Box cover, this is Dutty Berry and I have something to share with you guys. I have a show that is called DBS Exclusive. When did you realize that you had some sort of like talent?
When I go prep school and I dance, I could dance. Berry?
Two the video just start to go viral. No, this is where I talk to content creators from Instagram to YouTube to TikTok to Twitter, finding out about their story and their journey.
To even study.
I suppose many people are looking for the comparisons between us and them, as we are both on the front line of climate change.
Yes, I was making the point that in response to your question, David, that I was saying that we have more at stake in a sense because our economies are a lot more, I wouldn't say advanced, but we have a much more diversified economy in the Caribbean, larger populations and so on. But notwithstanding that, I think where they have gone and where the Pacific Islands in particular have gone, I would put the Pacific Islands much further than the Caribbean in terms of their regional ethic on climate change issues in particular and generally sustainable development. And I think that's where we need to go. I am not satisfied, for example, that our heads of government, when they meet, as compared with the Pacific Islands Forum, where climate change is an item on the agenda every single time the Pacific heads of government meet. And it's not just a superficial consideration, it's a pretty deep analysis of projects and issues and so on. So I think we have a ways to go, but I think the whole of society, the whole of society approach is exactly what we need going forward. I apologize for that.
No problem. These things happen. That is something that we have to mitigate against things like that as well. It's not a disaster.
That was a climate change.
Okay.
But yes, I think that's where we need to go.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. Next, we want to go to Dr. Anki Scott Joseph. She's the person who moderates the social media discussion. Good evening, Anki. What are they saying there?
Good evening. Good evening to you, David, and good evening to our viewers.
Our viewers here and our followers on Facebook are saying technology is causing climate change. We have seen the discussion looking at a controversial issue. Are we doing enough to address what is happening in the maritime industry as it relates to fishermen? What are we doing to ensure they also contribute to reducing the carbon footprint? David, we are seeing that individuals are generally accepting the responsibility to reducing their carbon footprint. But the main concern is, can the average man, can fishermen really afford what they need to put in place to have climate resilient resources at their hand? So I want to pose a question to Mr. Springer. What can be done to help the average man, the average fisherman, adopt, implement, and to have the climate resilient resources that are necessary for them to address? Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scott Joseph. Cletus Springer.
Thank you so much for that question, because this goes to the heart of what the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute has been doing over the past decade, working with fisher folk, working with peoples whose lives depend generally on nature, and helping them to build their resilience through their business practices and so on to help them to overcome climate change. The issue that fishers face generally have to do with the impacts that climate change is having on the ocean. Things like ocean acidification, things like increased ocean temperatures, which is reducing the oxygen that is available to our fisheries to survive. And we have had several episodes of fish kills in the Caribbean. The other thing that we're seeing is that fish stock are moving further away from the region. For various reasons, we have other issues that are complicating the impacts of climate change, issues of ocean pollution, issues of plastics and things of that sort. So what the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute is doing, and there's several others that are working in that field, the Caribbean Fisheries Mechanism is also actively working with fishers. I think you have to get down to the level of the actors themselves to help them to understand the challenges they face and to help them to build their resilience based on that understanding. There's a very interesting project in St. Lucia that I might tell you about very quickly. It's a device that has been developed by one of our researchers in the southern part of the country, where he has put together a fishing device or a marine device that relays to fishers in real time data on ocean dynamics, thermodynamics, fisheries aggregating devices, and so on. And that system is now being tested, and I think it has relevance for not just St. Lucia, but also for Pacific Island states and other small island states around the world, especially in the Marshall Islands and Nauru and in places like that.
Thank you, Cletus Springer. Yeah, yes, Professor Taylor.
There? Right.
Sure.
So I wanted to support that. Canary is one of the entities doing quite a lot of work. When you begin to look at the fishers there, as you have heard, part of the challenge is, of course, things like changing fish stock. You have the challenge of things like sea level rise, which changes, beaches, you erode beaches. And so you often sometimes have to have whole fishing communities that have to relocate from where their fish stocks are because you're getting the loss of beaches. When the fishers have to go further out to sea, they meet rougher climate and therefore rougher conditions. The whole infrastructure becomes endangered under, more intense weather. So you can begin to see that is a whole host of things that climate change is doing to the lives and livelihoods of fishers. I loved your question because it means, though, that they begin to see that they have a stake as well in advocating for their own resilience. There will be some actions they have to take on board. There are clearly some actions that at the levels of government that you have to come on board. And in fact, your question began with technology, and you heard about that. Technology has to play a role. And I would also add, a new a kind of invention that came out of a project the university ran and developed in St. Augustine Engineering, which is an official early warning system to tackle, when climate early warning system. So when you're having extreme climate, but it's just to round out that it's a number of ways in which climate are impacting fishes, and the levels of response. You will need multiple levels of response from the fisher themselves, but also going all the way up the line. But I love the question because it's a recognition that we need to adapt and we need to change how we approach this thing.
Rueanna Haynes spoke earlier about the enthusiasm of young people in the Marshall Islands in the fight against climate change. But here in the Caribbean, we also have young people who have an interest. And Maria Marshall is a young environmentalist. We're going to hear from her next. Good evening, Maria. She's one of our interveners. Good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for letting me speak today. My question is, why are we not managing what climate change is throwing at us? At this very moment, we have the sargassum seaweed, which is causing a lot of problems for us right now. And it is here due to lack of poor management of the environment and climate change.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. Let's get a reaction from Cletus Springer to that particular question. Cletus?
Yes, thank you very much. A very relevant question. On the east coast of St. Lucia in particular, the sargassum problem is very evident. Let me say, though, that the jury is still out as to whether and to the extent to which climate change is driving the sargassum problem. And that is because we have not done the full body of research to establish which of the manifestations of climate change may be contributing to sargassum proliferation in the region. As things now stand, we are only now looking at sea surface temperatures, that is regularly measured. And while many scientists have suggested that this could be the cause of the speed of growth of sargassum, I think we need more research to conclusively say whether there's a link between the two.
But there's another side to that question, please. Yeah. There's another side to that question, which is,
sure.
How we are managing the seaweed itself?
Yes, I was about to get to that. Right. So I was about to say that the management of sargassum is taking different forms. The management is limited because of the intrinsic nature of sargassum itself. It has very high levels of arsenic. It has very high levels of heavy metals, for example. And so while attempts are being made to derive a whole host of things, pharmaceuticals, textile paper, cardboard, containers, and so on, there are limitations in terms of how far we can go with that. However, in St. Lucia, there's a young man who was put together a very thriving industry using sargassum as a food fertilizer source. And his technology has been shared as far as the Pacific, and it is beginning to generate a lot of interest. So it's a very costly thing. It's costing about $180 million. The region is costing the region about $180 million a year to harvest the sargassum. But it is coming in such heavy loads that it's very, very difficult to get on top of it. So what some countries are trying to do, Mexico, for example, they're trying to catch the sargassum out at sea before it gets in, and that makes harvesting a lot easier. But there are efforts being made to harvest it.
A quick comment from you, Professor Taylor.
Yes, well, no, there's nothing to add to what Cletus has said. I would just want to tackle the other part of the question of our young questioner, where she asked, in the context then of climate change, using sargassum as an example, why are we not managing? I would have to begin by saying that there are lots of good entities working within the Caribbean. You have two represented right here with my fellow colleagues, Canary, as well as the Climate Analytics Caribbean branch. You have people like the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology right there in Barbados doing early warning systems and great climate work there. You have the 5Cs, you have entities within your own government. So there are lots of efforts underway to deal with climate, both from NGOs and other kinds of entities. But what I hear in her question then is, why are these not efforts seeming to suggest that we are managing? And therefore, what I would answer is, what I hear her saying is, we're still lacking a holistic approach to climate, where you can see the efforts being targeted in health, in agriculture, in biodiversity, in the finance sector, in the water sector. So the holistic element is still missing. I would hear in what she's saying, the consistency of efforts are probably still missing. So part of the challenge we sometimes have in our governments is consistency of effort. You agree to a Paris agreement that says limit global warming, which will come with reductions in greenhouse gases. You have to match that then with similar efforts in your energy policy. You have to match it in how you act with respect to biodiversity and nature. So I hear in her question, maybe the consistency is also missing in addition to the holistic effort. And I also hear the third thing in her question, that maybe the urgency is missing, that just like how the sargassum presents a clear problem, which we need to tackle, and we are tackling with innovation. What about that same kind of urgency? So I just wanted to pick up that part of her question, because I think it's a very good question, which is very telling, because we do have actions. The Central Bank of Barbados, with this whole function this evening, is an excellent action. It targets education. But she's saying clearly there are some missing elements. For me, the holistic approach, the consistent approach, and the urgency of the approach are what she's getting at.
Thank you. Here's a second intervener, Charlene Botley. She is Sustainable Energy Project Development and Gender Expert with the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. Good evening, Charlene.
Good evening, and very interesting discussions here tonight. My intervention really, for me, looks at the fact that the energy sector brings together climate mitigation and adaptation, the development of renewable energy, and by that I refer to, for example, solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, is key to climate change mitigation as the most effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, these very energy assets and infrastructure experience colossal damage from severe climate events in the Caribbean. Now, one solution has been distributed systems, which can result in greater climate resilience. And by that, I mean systems that are characterized by more spatial diversity as opposed to larger centralized systems. For example, the installation of smaller customer-sited systems or microgrid systems, which are essentially smaller independent systems that can serve small sections of the population. Now, given the power of these smaller systems and decentralized systems to achieve greater climate resilience, and I guess this might be more of a thought-provoking question, I do ask, how can we support and encourage investment in these decentralized systems? How can we bring these technologies to the majority or larger sections of populace? Thanks.
Thank you, Charlene Botley. Now, Rueanna Haynes, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I really think this is an excellent question, because sometimes when we speak to issues around, renewable energy and harnessing renewable energy resources, we frequently don't consider that these resources themselves are exposed and are vulnerable and do need to be protected if they're going to do what we would need them to do in terms of energy transformation and transformation of energy systems. So it's really a very excellent question. I think the proposed solution of having distributed systems that can be more resilient is an excellent one. It's one, however, that requires a high level of coordination across society, which has, for various reasons, been quite a challenge to achieve. So you need to have the governments on board. You also need to have your regulators and utilities on board. And in a lot of our countries, we're dealing with very, very outdated legislation that governs these systems, and it's a whole political process that requires a lot of political will to have these types of legislation actually amended. And then sometimes there are challenges, as we have seen in the past. You also require your private sector to be on board, because in most of our countries, this is where a lot of the investment is going to come in, as well as the populations. And for various reasons, unfortunately, citizens tend to be less responsive in some of these areas than they could be, unless there is an actual event or disaster that makes it topical. So, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, a few weeks ago, we experienced a nationwide blackout across the entirety of Trinidad that lasted for about 12 hours in some areas, where every single mode of communication, electricity, power was compromised because of, well, it's still under investigation, but an incident that happened at one particular power plant that impacted the entire grid. And, it's only after that that there was this great reckoning and national discussion about having distributed sources of power, based in renewable energy to help make our energy system overall more resilient. So at this point, I would say we definitely have the buy-in at the citizenry level. The question would be whether the government is in a position to move quickly enough to make sure that we can actually get some forward movement on this issue, and whether the private sector is ready to fall in behind, and whether the policies and the legislation that needs to be updated can be done to respond in an urgent manner. And these things, well, we have yet to see them happen.
One point that comes to mind here is that the question also speaks a little bit to opportunities and whether we are taking the chance to make lemonade from the limes that we are getting. How do you see that quickly?
This is back
yes,
to me
Rueanna?
again? Yes, well,
sorry.
definitely it speaks to the question of opportunities and whether we can actually move forward to, as you say, make lemonade out of the limes that we're given. I mean, we would expect, hopefully, based on the fact that there was a nationwide blackout, that coming out of the investigation that is supposed to be underway as to why it happened, there would be some very high level recommendations about how we can actually make our energy system more resilient, more sustainable, that the government would take the opportunity to turn that corner on transforming our very, very heavily fossil fuel centered energy system and take the next step. But it remains to be seen.
Let's turn next to what some people are saying or asking via email or WhatsApp. This particular comment is a question. Is there a roadmap for countries to build a culture of resilience to climate change? I suppose, Cletus, we should come to you with that particular question. You began
Yes.
by raising some concerns. Yes.
Yes, there is a roadmap. Many countries have national policies and strategies. There is a Caribbean-wide policy and strategy that was developed by the 5Cs, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. I think that strategy went up to 2020, and new one may have been developed since. As I said at the start, the problem is not a lack of strategy per se. The problem is implementation. The problem is financing. The problem is creativity. The problem is bringing the entire society on board. The problem is working with the private sector to ensure things like supply chains are not affected in the event that the agricultural system is disrupted during a storm and things of that sort. So I do believe that in terms of roadmaps, the region has enough of those. And what is needed now is for us to mainstream climate change adaptation and climate action in the development planning process.
We take another email or WhatsApp. It's a question or a comment. Yes. It says that although much attention and investment is given to mitigation efforts, what are Caribbean islands doing in terms of climate change adaptation? More specifically, how are our islands dealing with the sea level rising? And this comes back to the comment which you had made a short while ago, Cletus, and what you said otherwise. This raises another question. What exactly is at the core of the lethargy that you have referred to? In other areas, people talk about political will. Is that it?
I think it's a little bit more than that. I think we have to move the rhetoric on climate change beyond extreme weather events and hurricanes. That's where the discussion is. If you ask the average citizen in the Caribbean of their perception of climate change, they would link it to hurricanes and increased intensity of hurricanes. But it's a lot more than that. It's
Thank
about, yeah.
Yes, thank you. When we come back, we will hear from another of the interveners.
What if they knew that you abused her? Her family?
Mr. Jones.
And your colleagues, how will they look at an abuser? When the law comes knocking, you'll have nowhere to run.
Mr. Brown, you're under arrest. Please get up, hands behind your head and interlock your fingers.
Turn your back on abusers. Report gender-based violence to the police. There's no excuse for abuse. Call the Bureau of Gender Affairs at 876-754-8577.
What a way you're full of our roots and culture. That was in Jamaica 60. Jamaica 60? What a piece of news, Miss Matty. I feel like my heart going bust up.
Just in, the island of Jamaica is on the verge of celebrating its 60th year of independence.
I only well for celebrating it. They say the people them in them come here, you know. But you see, when our people decide, say the other people them free paper, burn up, them say if it's war, start.
Together, we can create a safer Jamaica for our children. We need to get the guns and save our country.
Jamaica and its workforce are advancing quickly. Life-changing opportunities are arising. You need training and support. We are the Renewed Heart NSTA Trust, committed to providing new and emerging skills training and opportunities. Come to Heart. We'll help you claim your place in the workforce of the future.
I lost my husband to gun violence. My child will never know her father. Jamaica, please stop the senseless killings.
Is the second vice president of the Barbados Professional Association of Professional Engineers, and he is another of our interveners this evening. Good evening, Mr. Jones.
Hi, good evening, David, and good evening to your panel.
My question follows on similarly to the one that you were just asking. Storm surge has become a stark, unfortunate reality with the strengthening of tropical hurricanes. The way in which most of the islands in the Caribbean were developed, and this fact holds true for most other nations that are not landlocked, have placed us in a precarious position where most of our capital cities are in coastal regions, and as such have resulted in most of the critical national infrastructure being usually located in coastal regions. My question is, how important is it for regional governments, given the impacts of rising sea levels, storm surge, and even the threat of tsunamis, to look seriously at coastal defenses, start to relocate critical services from our coastal environments?
Cletus Springer, I'd like you to take that question.
Very quickly, I can tell you there have been a number of studies of critical infrastructure in the Caribbean and their vulnerability to climate change. I have not seen evidence of relocation of such infrastructure, and that might be because of the sheer cost. It might be also that the decision was made that it is better to remain in place and adapt and mitigate the impacts rather than move. These are all policy options that have been adopted. But here again, I think Dominica is the most advanced among our countries in looking at that in a very, very serious way.
Thank you. Let's go to some more emails and WhatsApps. Good evening. This question says, the changes required to build resilience will necessitate financing. Is such financing in place at both the private and public sector levels, or will the state have to take the lead? Rueanna, do you want to take the lead in answering this question?
I'm happy to start. I would say that it is inevitable in our context and or the way our economies are structured that the state will have to take the lead in a lot of these things. It's my view that for the most part, we do have quite vibrant private sectors throughout the region in some instances, but it's not the same situation as we would have in larger economies. And so, for the most part, even though the private sector in our context does have an important role to play, and in fact, in some contexts, they do play a leadership role, and then governments tend to fall into line afterwards. The governments, I think, are in a position where they have to take the lead primarily because of limited resources that are available, and primarily because even where finance is available, if you do not have the policy environment in place, that finance really does not have a chance of creating the kind of impacts that we need to see happen. So I think there's always going to be, in our small context, a central and important role for the state.
Cletus Springer, you would have heard Barbados and other Caribbean countries arguing the case on the international stage for more funds to be established, SDR, special drawing rights on the International Monetary Fund. The argument is that the international community really needs to do more, since they are the principal persons responsible for the climate change that we are seeing. Therefore, they need to do more to put us in a position to be able to adapt. What are your thoughts on that? I know you began by saying that you think that there is a misplaced emphasis, that we are spending too much time looking at that rather than putting things in place ourselves. But what about that dimension to it?
Right. I want to amend that earlier statement a little bit and say that what we need is a parallel approach to pushing the international community to meet its obligations, as well as doing what we can at the national level. David, I was at the Copenhagen conference I think it was in 2009, when the international community pledged $100 billion a year to help countries on the front line of climate change impacts. That pledge has not been met. We are averaging between 70 and 80 million dollars, billion dollars, I beg your pardon, a year. And what is interesting is that this is not new money. And if you look at the wording of a lot of the international agreements on climate change, it says new and additional funding. So a lot of the money is money that was already programmed by the international community, and it is not new money. So so that money is coming in drips and drabs. And what is more frustrating is that it's taken a lot of time to draw it down. And part of that is because we don't have our house in order. We don't have enough human resources dealing with project design and things of that sort. But I would like to say that, yes, we have to keep their feet to the fire. We have to push for them to make good on their promises.
Professor Taylor, your thoughts on it?
Yes. Well, I actually just want to pick up on the end of what Cletus has said about keeping their feet in the fire. You know, one of the things about the latest IPCC report, which was released on Monday, and again, you know, IPCC being the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN mandated entity to collate and disseminate the latest science on climate, is that it makes an unambiguous statement that 1.5 degrees, and you might have heard about this in the full phrase 1.5 to stay alive. You know, I don't want to be introducing terms that people 1.5 degrees mean we must not warm more than 1.5 degrees by the end of this century compared to our temperatures in pre-industrial time. Now, you have to put in that we have already warmed about 1 degree. So the small island states have said, you know, listen, we have warmed 1, we cannot warm more than half a degree more if we are going to be viable. I use that as a context to say that report that came out on Monday made such a stark statement that, listen, any talk about climate resilient development for the most vulnerable is foolish talk if it puts on the table anything above 1.5 degrees. Now, what you need to read into that statement is the science saying, listen, we cannot exceed 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, but we're on the way to 2 and 3 degrees. And therefore, we in the Caribbean have kind of multiple roles. One, we have the ammunition to hold the rest of the world accountable, because this is the science saying it. Listen, you can't go above 1.5 degrees or the most vulnerable like us will cease to have any pathway to viability. What does that mean then? We need the adaptation financing that the international community has to put on the table. We also need additional financing beyond that, because even some of the things we are doing to adapt now will no longer be able to work and stave off the worst impacts of climate change if should we go even a tenth of a degree higher than 1.5 degree. So I am, you know, picking that up. And then, of course, it also puts on the table that in the Caribbean, we also can't divorce ourselves from taking action. So we can't be out there saying everybody else must do this. The truth is 1.5 degrees is going to be a challenging situation for us in the Caribbean. We're talking about further warming. We're talking about more variability in our rainfall. We're talking about more intense storms. So we, at the same time that we are demanding the greater funding, we need to begin, the science at least is saying, to program those adaptation things within how we operate to ensure that we can have a resilient future. But I think the science report on Monday, you know, makes a strong statement about roles and responsibilities of both us and especially the rest of the world.
Let's take another email or WhatsApp message. How are we across the region measuring the effectiveness, that is, the resistance, recovery, and robustness of the initiatives put in place to build resilience? That's Rueanna. How do you respond to that? How are we measuring it?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I would say that we're not measuring it very well, if we are measuring it at all. Um, Even at the global level, adaptation metrics have proven themselves to be very elusive and very difficult to actually agree and define. So when you bring it down to the regional level, those problems become even more exacerbated in terms of what are the metrics that we're using to measure against? Where are the agreed international metrics? Are there agreed international metrics? Aside from that, though, in addition to just looking at general effectiveness of resilience actions, adaptation measures, we do know that there are many examples of maladaptation that happen throughout the region, where, for example, roads are built, roads that rest along the coast that tend to be flooded, major roadways are elevated, and then that elevation also proves to be ineffective against increasing sea level rise and increasing flooding. And there are examples of that right here going on in Trinidad and Tobago as well. And so it happens, at least from my observation, that even where there are these major, in particular, infrastructure projects geared towards resilience, they tend to fall short in certain areas. And the question as to whether their effectiveness is being measured is one that, from my point of view, is usually not adequately considered. I think there's a lot more effort that needs to be placed into that type of work, and it involves a lot more longer term planning. It involves a lot more mainstreaming. It involves a lot more that really needs to be improved.
With Cletus Springer, that will put us in a position where some outside of the region would say, you're asking for money to help, but you're doing such a poor job that you may well end up wasting it. How do you respond to that?
No, I don't think that argument. I don't think that argument will hold, David, because one of the reasons why we are not able to do it as completely and as comprehensively as we could is because we don't have the resources to do it. In our region, when you have a budget, when you're facing budget deficits and your fiscal windows are very limited, you have a choice between building a road with drainage or building a road without drainage. And in some countries, especially in the farm belt in many countries, the road tends to be more important than the drain. So these are the kind of unfortunate choices that we face in the region. But the more critical argument that we have to take to the international community is that we are not responsible for the situation in which we find ourselves. You are, and there's no debate about that. It is your greenhouse gases that is increasing the situation. So we want to be obviously in a position to make the best use of the funds that are made available, but there's no evidence that we are not making, because these projects anyway are financed by the international community, and they have their own safeguards and they have their own oversight mechanisms to ensure that it is being done well.
Okay, thank you. Let's take another question. Are we paying sufficient attention in the Caribbean to how climate change can possibly impact capital investments, asset management, or even mergers, acquisitions, and divestment plans? If not, how do we deal with these gaps? Do you want to take that, Professor Taylor?
Oh, I think you're putting me way outside of my lane here. The only way I would really want to answer that is to say, and I will allow my other colleagues to answer that, bearing in mind where I'm coming from, is to say it's a very good question on two fronts. One, climate change is equally an important topic and thing for the financial sector to deal with, you know, in that it really impacts right across. And so this question is pointing to that, the importance of tackling climate change from the context of the financial sector. I'm not the person to answer the other parts of that question. But the other part of that, what I hear in that question as well is, how well are we taking climate change when we have large development plans into consideration? And the truth is that right across the Caribbean, whether it is a large development in terms of acquisitions and mergers, or whether it's a large infrastructural development project, we need to make sure that climate change is an integral part of the planning of those projects, the execution of those projects, and that those projects look not just at how the climate is changing now, but also factor in what is to come, so that those projects will have a life and a sustainability and can make the kind of transformative, have the kind of transformative impact that they want to have. So my answer is, I can answer the other part, is the financial sector, yes, must tackle climate change. And two, large development projects have to have climate considerations mainstream into them. But I would allow the other panelists to pick up the specifics about assets and mergers.
Rueanna Haynes, I'd like you to tackle it.
I don't even know if this is in my wheelhouse, but what I will say is, as far as I understand, this issue is under the purview in the sense of insurance. I know that at the regional level, various insurance agencies are very, very au fait with this question of climate risk and the risk in the region, and they are addressing it to some degree. As far as banking and other financial institutions are concerned, I would say that when we look at banking institutions, especially those that originate from outside of the region, it's very clear that they're taking the issue much more seriously in their parent countries than they are in the region itself. There's a great disconnect between the level of action, the level of awareness, even the rhetoric that they advance in their parent countries, as opposed to the actions that they actually take, the investments that they make, the level of importance that they give to the issue here on the ground in the region where the vulnerabilities actually exist. And I think that is an issue that needs to be addressed. It's one that we need to be shining a greater light on. So I think it's an excellent question for that reason. And I'll leave it there.
Well, Cletus Springer, you need to respond to this one, but I would point you in the direction of looking at the highly controversial area of insurance as well.
Yeah, in fact, that was where I was going, and I agree with Rueanna 125%. The parent companies of the insurance companies in the region are looking at climate change, but if you look at the risk profile of the Caribbean, and if climate change was truly factored into the risk profile of the Caribbean from an insurance perspective, our insurance premiums would be far higher than they are at the moment. And that is why I believe governments have an interest in ensuring that the risk profile of the region is kept at a manageable level for the particular reason of the insurance premiums. The other thing too in that risk profile is there's an inequity in terms of the contribution to the risk profile. If you look at a hotel in a vulnerable zone like the coastal zone, the insurance for that property raises the risk profile of just the mere sighting of that property in that vulnerable zone raises the risk profile of the country. The other thing too is that the banks and the insurance companies have a relationship insofar as mortgages are concerned on properties. If you build a house in a flood zone, not only is the insurance premium for that house high, but it also places the bank's ability to recover that property in the event of a damage. It reduces that as well. So what I'm not seeing in the region is And I know many years ago, CARICOM did a study on insurance and reinsurance in the Caribbean. There was a task force that was set up to do that. I believe that work needs to be updated significantly. Professor Taylor at the university at the insurance company of the West Indies in Jamaica was the chair of that. But that study needs to be updated pretty rapidly, I would say.
Let's see what else they're asking or saying by email or WhatsApp. This one says, I hear the talk about there being a number of roadmaps, but how is this helpful when citizens are unaware of these roadmaps and their respective roles in building this resilience? Is that a valid criticism, Rueanna?
I would say it definitely is a useful observation. And that is because one thing that we tend to gloss over when we speak about climate action and responding to climate change is the difference in responsibilities between what the government has to do and then what the individual citizen has to do. And, this has come up often in my work where people would ask me in a very frustrated manner, but what does that mean for me as an individual? What can I do? And truth be told, in the context of climate adaptation specifically, there are a number of actions that individuals can take, and we've discussed some of them in terms of, it comes down to where you place your home, how you build your home, how your home is insured, the materials that you use for your roof, all of these types of considerations that you can take, whether you opt for some type of solar power, backup power for your home, and these types of measures. But they mean very, very little in a context where there has not been a similar mainstreaming prioritization of action at a systemic level that only the government can do. And so there is that difference in responsibilities and scope of responsibilities. And there's many things that you can do as an individual, and there are roadmaps that exist for that. But in the same way that Professor Taylor said that if we're dealing with an increase in average global temperature of 2 degrees Celsius, no amount of adaptation will help us, and climate resilient development is foolishness. It's the same way that at the national level, no amount of individual action can protect you if the government is not also doing its part. And so I think when Cletus spoke to the existence of roadmaps, he spoke to the existence of a very dense climate adaptation policy environment that exists throughout the region, but that is lacking implementation, which is necessary.
Thank you. Let's take another question. Does the structure of public and private sector boards in the Caribbean, based on knowledge and skill sets, allow for effective oversight of climate change issues, and by extension, the ability to build resilience? Cletus?
We're getting some really tough questions from our public, I have to say, and they're very pointed questions and very relevant as well. I would say no. That would be the short answer to that question. When you look at the structure of the average board of the private sector, or even a statutory corporation in our region, you tend to have somebody who has an expertise in finance, somebody who has an expertise in accounting, somebody with expertise in management, and so on. You tend not to see somebody with expertise in environmental stewardship or corporate social responsibility that takes climate change issues into consideration. And I think in terms of where we want to go with climate change, we need to make a quantum leap with that. You attend the average annual general meeting of a company, and you don't hear climate change being raised in the context of an AGM of an electric utility company, for example, where a shareholder will ask the question, what are you doing to combat climate change? What are you doing to risk-proof your installations, which are usually within the coastal zone, and so on. So there was a previous question that Rueanna answered, and I want to piggyback my response to this question on hers, and to say that this whole of society approach that I speak about, we have the policies, yes, in terms of product, but the process by which a lot of these policies were developed, in my view, were not sufficiently consultative. They were not sufficiently participatory in terms of bringing the public on board. And if you look at the average policy and you look for allocation of roles and responsibilities in there, you will not see, you are not likely to see allocation of roles for the citizen or for the private sector. The emphasis of these policies tend to be very government-centric. So we have a lot of work to do to bring our whole culture for climate action on par with what is taking place in the developed world.
Okay, so we are at this stage in the discussion this evening where we're going to ask for your closing comments, only about 30 seconds each. And that brings us to the question of how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the Caribbean's effort to build resilience and adapt to climate change? And I'll come first to you, Professor Taylor, in 30 seconds.
Okay, thanks. I have to tell you that notwithstanding that the science that I do has a very pessimistic outlook, I remain pretty optimistic in my eventual outlook, because I believe it is not beyond us as a region to respond to climate change and build the kind of resilient societies that we want. We see the building blocks already being, pieces of it already being put in place. We have excellent institutions that are already playing their part. We have NGOs, we have, academic institutions, we have parts of government. What we now need is to bring it together. But I really do not think it is beyond us as a region. We have, tackled other things in the past. So I remain optimistic. I think what I would like to end with is that, kind of a phrase that I always put out there. The truth is, once we come to terms with the fact that the climate has changed and has already changed, so we have to deal with the unfamiliar that we are in now, and then come to the top to recognize that the climate is going to continue to change. And so we have to deal with the unprecedented, which is to come. The challenge is, of course, dealing with both of those at the same time. Then we immediately come to that realization that climate demands change. And all we have been talking about this evening is the ways in which that change must manifest itself for a resilient future.
Thank you. Rueanna Haynes?
I don't have much to add to what Professor Taylor has said. I would say that a colleague of mine always says that optimism is an occupational hazard when you work on climate issues. And so, yes, I remain optimistic. I am of the same view as Professor Taylor that we do have the tools and the talent that we need to respond appropriately. And I am optimistic that we will respond. I hope that that response will happen in sufficient time.
And Cletus Springer, 30 seconds.
Right. Well, I agree with Prof. Taylor, and I agree with Rueanna. The facts are clear. Climate change is a reality. It is a threat to our development prospects. It's a threat to our livelihoods, and so we have to deal with it. I want to pivot. I want to change the question a little bit and say, really and truly, we really don't have a choice but to take urgent steps to adapt. We've come a long way. We were the first region to implement a climate change adaptation project in the developing world, with the climate change adaptation project in 1997 or thereabouts. We've had projects since, mainstreaming adaptation and so on. What we need to do, though, is to keep our own feet to the fire on climate change and make the urgent policy and strategic changes at all levels of society.
Thank you very much, panelists. And thanks to those of you who contributed to tonight's discussion. Thanks to the Central Bank of Barbados. And we need to remind you that the next session of the Caribbean Economic Forum will take place on May 5th. That's when the Central Bank will be celebrating the 15th anniversary of this forum. I am David Ellis, and I want to thank you all very much and wish you a pleasant night.
The point of wearing a mask is to prevent the spread of air droplets from persons who may or may not be infected. When wearing a mask, please ensure that the mask goes above the nose and below the chin. This might be a bit uncomfortable, but it's for your own safety. The position of the mask is very important.